October the 3rd, 1907. New York City. The morning air along the southern tip of Manhattan carried the particular smell of a financial district at full operation. Coal smoke drifting down from the elevated railway on Greenwich Street, the faint mechanical smell of the printing presses working through the night in the newspaper buildings on Park Row, the smell of horses and leather, and the concentrated human activity of large numbers of people moving through narrow streets with a shared and urgent purpose. The temperature was mild for early October, somewhere around 14 degrees Celsius, and a thin autumn haze hung over the lower end of the island, softening the light that came between the tall buildings into something pale and indirect. The trees in the small churchyard of Trinity Church at the head of Wall Street had begun to turn, the first yellows and bronzes of the season appearing at the edges of leaves that had been green through the long, hot summer, and their colour was the only soft thing in a landscape that was otherwise composed entirely of stone and steel and glass and the relentless forward motion of commerce. It was a Thursday, the kind of Thursday that, in most cities and most lives, passed without particular distinction. Clerks arrived at their offices in the tall buildings that lined Broadway and Wall Street and Nassau, hanging their hats on the hooks behind their doors and opening their ledgers at the pages where they had left them the evening before. The ticker machines in the brokerage houses began their morning chatter, the thin paper tape running through their mechanisms in a continuous record of prices that men in shirt sleeves tore off at intervals and read with the practiced speed of people who had been reading numbers this way for years. Banks opened their heavy doors at the usual hour, the guards in their uniforms taking up their positions, the tellers settling behind their brass grills, the morning light from the street falling across the marble floors in long, pale rectangles that would shorten as the day progressed and the sun moved south. The world went about its business in the ordinary way. But along the canyon of Wall Street and in the great marble buildings that lined it, and in the counting houses and trust company offices that filled the blocks between Broadway and the East River, something had been accumulating for months that was not ordinary, and that was not entirely invisible to those who knew how to read what they were seeing. The stock market had been declining since the spring, fitfully at first, and then with increasing consistency, in the manner of a patient whose symptoms have been ambiguous for a long time and are now beginning to resolve into a diagnosis. Call money rates, the interest charged on loans made to investors who were using borrowed funds to buy securities, had risen several times in the preceding months, each rise a sign of tightening credit and declining confidence in the institutions that provided it. Several smaller banks and trust companies had reported increased withdrawal activity. The copper market, which had been the subject of considerable speculative excitement for several years, copper being the metal of the electrical age, the raw material of the telegraph and the telephone, and the new electrical systems that were being installed in cities across the country, had begun to crack. These were not individually alarming. They were the kind of ordinary financial turbulence that the markets experienced every few years, the normal fluctuations of an economy that was growing very fast, and that had not yet developed the institutional infrastructure necessary to manage that growth with stability. Taken together by someone who had the knowledge to assemble them into a coherent picture, they described a financial landscape that was becoming fragile in ways that were not yet visible to the general public, to the depositors who kept their savings in the trust companies of Midtown Manhattan, to the factory workers whose wages depended on the credit that kept their employers solvent, to the farmers in Ohio and Kansas, whose mortgages were held by the correspondent banks of the great New York institutions, but that were very visible indeed to the 70-year-old man who sat in his private library on Madison Avenue on the morning of October the 3rd, reading the financial newspapers with the attention of someone who has been reading this particular kind of bad news for a very long time. John Pierpont Morgan. He was, in October of 1907, the most powerful private citizen in the United States. This was not honorific or a journalistic exaggeration. It was a description of a specific and measurable reality, that the financial decisions made by one man, from an office at 23 Wall Street and a library at 219 Madison Avenue, had more influence over the direction of the American economy than the decisions made by any elected official in Washington, including the President of the United States, and that this had been true for the better part of 2 decades. He had not sought this position in any conventional political sense. He had not run for anything, had not campaigned for anything, had not made promises to any constituency. He had arrived at it through the cumulative effect of 40 years of managing financial crises that the government lacked either the authority or the mechanisms to manage, and through the particular quality of his reputation, the reputation of a man who, when he said that something would be done, did it. He was 70 years old. He had been born in Hartford, Connecticut, in April of 1837, the son of Junius Spencer Morgan, a prosperous New England merchant who had subsequently moved to London to become a partner in the banking firm of George Peabody and Company, one of the most respected private institutions engaged in the business of financing American enterprises from a European base. The family had been comfortable without being conspicuously wealthy, cultivated without being aristocratic, Protestant in the serious manner of New England Protestantism that took both its theology and its ethics as working guides to daily life, rather than as social ornaments. Junius Morgan had instilled in his son two convictions that Pierpont carried throughout his entire career: that a banker's reputation for keeping his word was the most valuable asset he possessed, more valuable than any particular transaction or any particular relationship, and that the management of this reputation required the willingness to refuse transactions that were dishonest, regardless of their profitability. These were not novel ideas. They were, in the business culture of the mid-19th century, the common property of the respectable mercantile class. What was unusual about Pierpont Morgan was not that he held these convictions, but that he acted on them with a consistency that very few of his contemporaries matched, that he refused, across a career of 50 years and a great many temptations, to depart from the standards he had inherited from his father and had made his own. He had been in finance since the beginning of the Civil War, when his father had arranged for him to join the New York agent of the firm as a junior employee. He had been 36 when the Panic of 1873 had nearly destroyed the railroad industry, and a substantial portion of the banking sector with it. He had been 47 when the Panic of 1884 had swept through the market. He had been 56 when the United States Treasury's gold reserve had fallen so low that the government had been unable to maintain the gold standard, and he had organized the private financing that saved it, traveling to Washington and sitting across a table from President Grover Cleveland and offering terms that Cleveland had initially rejected and then, under the pressure of events, accepted. He had been 56 also when the Panic of 1893 had destroyed 500 banks and 15,000 businesses and driven unemployment above 10%, and he had organized the response to that as well. He had reorganized the Pennsylvania Railroad, the Erie Railroad, the Reading Railroad, and several others, imposing on their chaotic finances the discipline of what his contemporaries called Morganization, a process that was not always gentle, that sometimes required the displacement of existing management and the imposition of new financial structures that the existing ownership did not welcome, but that produced, in case after case, institutions that were sounder and more stable than the ones that had preceded them. All of this history lived in him in October of 1907 as a resource, not as nostalgia or as self-congratulation. Morgan was not much given to either, but as a body of practical knowledge about what financial panics looked like in their early stages, how they developed, what could be done to stop them and what could not, and what the cost of stopping them was likely to be. He had this knowledge in a way that was not available from books or from business school or from the study of financial history, but only from having been present and having been responsible when things went wrong on a large scale. He was sitting in the East Room of the library at 219 Madison Avenue when the morning of October the 3rd began. The East Room was the principal room of the building he had constructed specifically to house his art collections and to serve as a private working space, a room approximately 40 feet long and 30 feet wide, the upper portions of the walls occupied by 3 tiers of bookshelves behind ornate bronze grilles. The lower portions hung with paintings and tapestries that had, before they arrived in this room, belonged to European nobility and the great private collections of the continent. The fireplace at the end of the room was faced in carved sienna marble, large enough to stand in, and a fire had been laid and lit on this October morning, not because the weather required it, but because Morgan habitually had fires in the rooms he occupied in the autumn and winter months, and because the quality of a firelit room in the morning, when the rest of the light was still pale and indirect, was the quality he preferred for this particular kind of work. He was not, in most respects, a man who invited neutral reactions. Those who encountered him for the first time almost invariably noted two things: his physical presence and his eyes. He was not especially tall, perhaps 5 feet 11, but he was broad and solid in the way of a man who had been physically powerful in youth and whose body had retained the memory of that power even as age accumulated around it. He moved slowly and with deliberateness, not the slowness of infirmity, but the deliberateness of a man who had long since stopped needing to hurry for anyone. His hands were large and steady. His voice was deep and used sparingly, in the manner of someone who had learned that words carry more weight when they are rationed. But it was the eyes that people remembered. They were dark and deep-set under heavy brows, and they had about them a quality that observers struggled to describe adequately. Some said they were intimidating, some said they were simply very intelligent. Some, and this was perhaps closest to the truth, said they looked like the eyes of a man who had long since stopped being surprised by anything and who was perpetually calmly assessing whatever was in front of him. His face was marked by a condition called rhinophyma, a severe form of rosacea that had over the years disfigured his nose, enlarging it, reddening it, giving it the bulbous appearance that appeared in every photograph ever taken of him, and that he was known to be sensitive about in the way of someone too proud to show that they are sensitive about something. He managed it in the way he managed most things that were not subject to his control, by proceeding as though the obstacle were not there, by the force of the self-assurance that 70 years of being, in almost every room he entered, the most consequential person present had built in him. He read the financial papers with a pencil in his hand, making marks in the margins in his precise, slightly cramped handwriting. The marks were not annotations of opinion, but markers of things that needed to be checked against other things, questions that needed answers, numbers that needed to be assembled with other numbers before they meant what they might mean. His reading was not casual. It was the reading of someone assembling a picture from fragments, testing each new piece against what was already assembled, noting where the picture was coherent and where it had gaps. The picture he was assembling on the morning of October the 3rd concerned a man named F. Augustus Heinze, and what Heinze had been attempting to do with the shares of the United Copper Company. Heinze was a mining entrepreneur from Montana, short and energetic and possessed of a considerable appetite for risk, who had made a substantial fortune in the copper mines of Butte through a combination of genuine technical skill and aggressive legal tactics in the courts of Montana, where he had spent years disputing the ownership of underground copper deposits with the Anaconda Copper Mining Company. He had arrived in New York in the early years of the century with money and ambition, had established himself as a banker as well as a miner by taking control of several institutions including the Mercantile National Bank, and had devised what he believed was a reliable scheme for making a great deal more money than he already had. The scheme was a corner. In the language of Wall Street at the turn of the century, a corner was an attempt by a single buyer or coordinated group of buyers to acquire enough of a company's shares that the short sellers, investors who had borrowed shares, sold them, and expected to profit by buying them back at a lower price, were compelled to buy from the corner at whatever price the corner dictated. Corners had been attempted before in American financial history. Some had succeeded, most had failed, and the failures had been expensive in proportion to the ambition of the attempt. Heinze's corner on United Copper failed. He had bought shares aggressively through Monday and Tuesday of the previous week, driving the price from just over $30 to above $60, creating the appearance of a powerful buying movement that he expected to force the short sellers to cover at his price. Instead, the short sellers found shares elsewhere, from sources Heinze had not anticipated, through mechanisms he had not accounted for, and on Wednesday the price collapsed, falling back through 30 and continuing down, leaving Heinze holding a position he had financed partly with borrowed money and could no longer support. The direct loss to Heinze was large. The indirect consequences were what concerned Morgan. Heinze had financed his speculation partly through the Mercantile National Bank. When the collapse became public, and it became public very quickly, because the price movements were visible and the newspapers were staffed with financial reporters who understood what they were looking at, depositors at the Mercantile National had begun to appear at its doors and ask for their money. This was the mechanism, not a metaphor, not an abstraction, a literal queue of people at a door, withdrawing their deposits in cash, driven by the calculation that a bank whose president had just lost a great deal of money in a failed speculation might be a bank whose deposits were not entirely safe. The calculation was, in this case, more reasonable in appearance than in financial reality. The Mercantile National's actual condition was not as precarious as the Q suggested, but the Q itself created the precariousness it feared. Every dollar withdrawn was a dollar no longer available to meet the next withdrawal, and the process, once running, would eventually exhaust any institution regardless of its underlying soundness. Morgan listened to the reports about Heinze and the Mercantile with the particular stillness that those who worked beside him had come to recognize as characteristic of his manner in serious situations. Not the stillness of inattention. He was assembling what he heard against what he already knew, testing the picture, but the stillness of a man who had learned that the display of anxiety in a crisis was itself a form of action, and not a useful one. He asked several questions. The questions were precise and followed a logic that was not immediately apparent to those who heard them, but that would, over the days that followed, reveal itself as an early mapping of the connections through which a panic in one institution could travel to others. He was not alarmed. This was one of the things that made him different from almost every other person in almost every room at almost every critical moment of his working life. The absence of alarm in situations that alarmed others. It was not that he failed to understand the danger. He understood it with greater clarity than anyone else in the city. It was that he had arrived, across 40 years, at the conclusion that alarm was not useful in a crisis, that it communicated itself to others and made problems larger, that the quality most needed when confidence was failing was not urgency, but the specific kind of calm that comes from having been through it before, and knowing, with the precision of a man who has navigated the same waters under different conditions many times, that it can be managed. He gave several instructions and returned to the morning's work. The Mercantile National was not, in itself, a systemically important institution. Its collapse, if it came, would be painful for its depositors and damaging to the broader confidence of the market. But it would not by itself bring down the American financial system. What Morgan was watching, what he would continue to watch with increasing attention as the days passed, was not the Mercantile National in isolation, but the web of connections between it and other institutions, the network of obligation and deposit and trust and correspondent relationship that linked the banks and trust companies of New York into something that was not quite a system, but that behaved like one when it was under stress. The particular vulnerability of the moment was the trust companies. They had grown rapidly in the preceding decade, occupying a position in the financial landscape somewhere between a bank and an investment fund. They accepted deposits, as banks did, but they were subject to lower reserve requirements than the nationally chartered banks, which meant they could lend more aggressively and generate higher returns for their depositors. This made them attractive to the investing public and profitable for their owners, and it also meant they were operating with thinner margins of safety than the regulated institutions, and that their depositors, if they lost confidence, had fewer protections. The largest of the trust companies was the Knickerbocker Trust Company, with deposits of approximately $60 million and a client base that included a substantial fraction of the comfortable middle class of New York. Its president was Charles T. Barney, a man of considerable social standing and financial reputation whose institution had, over the preceding decade, grown into one of the most prominent financial organizations in the city. Barney was known to have had business dealings with Heinze. This connection, which was, in the event, less significant than it appeared in the newspaper accounts of the following weeks, was enough in the atmosphere of those days to direct the anxious attention of depositors and reporters toward the Knickerbocker. It did not need to be specific or well documented to do the damage it would do. It needed only to exist, and to be known, and to be read by people who were already afraid. Morgan spent the afternoon in the partners' room receiving reports and giving instructions. The ticker in the corner printed its steady record of declining prices. Call money rates had risen again. The atmosphere in the financial district had taken on the particular quality it took on when a large number of professional people were all watching the same situation, and none of them wanted to be the first to show that they were watching it. He dined that evening at Madison Avenue with members of his family, and with guests whose names are not in the surviving records of this period, but who were, by the pattern of his calendar, almost certainly connected to institutions that were beginning to require attention. After dinner, he returned to the library. The East Room at night had a quality different from its daytime self. The fire burned lower. The electric lights were supplemented by candles set in various fixtures around the room, and the books in their bronze-grilled cases caught the combined light in a way that gave the room a quality of depth and accumulated attention, the quality of a space where much important thinking had been done over many years, and where the thinking had left its residue in the atmosphere, the way that music leaves something in a room after it has stopped. He sat in the leather armchair near the fireplace and worked through a set of documents his staff had prepared on the condition of the major trust companies. He read carefully. He made marks. He sat for a time when he had finished reading, with the documents in his lap and the fire at the corner of his vision, thinking about what he had read in the way that he thought in these quiet evening hours. Not the fast, collaborative thinking of the partners' room, where information moved quickly and decisions emerged from the exchange of multiple minds, but the slower, solitary thinking of a man assembling a picture alone, following the implications of what he knew to their logical conclusions, testing those conclusions against what he knew about the behavior of financial institutions and financial markets and financial human beings under stress. The picture he was assembling was not comfortable. The American financial system was becoming fragile in ways that he had seen before, in 1873 and 84 and 93, though the specific configuration of the fragility was different each time. The trust companies were undercapitalized relative to their exposures. The connections between them and the regulated banks were close enough that a failure in one sector could propagate to the other. The newspapers were watching and reporting, which meant that depositors were reading, which meant that the psychological dimension of the situation, the dimension of confidence and fear, was as important as the financial one. He had managed these dimensions before. He knew what the work would require, knowledge of which institutions were genuinely solvent and which were not, resources committed quickly enough to prevent the failure of the ones that were sound but illiquid, and the kind of coordination among the major banks that only he, by virtue of his reputation and the trust that the financial community placed in his judgment, could organize with the necessary speed. The resources did not exist in a single institution or a single person. They existed in the aggregate holdings of the major New York banks and trust companies and the private wealth of the men who controlled them, and they could be mobilized only if those men could be persuaded to act together rather than separately, to suppress the individual instinct for self-protection that crises reliably produced, and to commit to a collective response. This persuasion was the work that he was uniquely positioned to do, not because he was the wealthiest man in the room. He was not always the wealthiest man in the room, not in a city of Rockefellers and Vanderbilts and Astors, but because he was the most trusted, because his word meant something specific and verifiable, because the financial community had 40 years of evidence that when Morgan committed to something, the thing was done, and because in a crisis, when confidence had failed everywhere else, his remained as a fixed point around which the response could organize itself. He set down the documents. He looked at the fire for a time without moving. Outside on Madison Avenue, the city had grown quiet, the evening traffic reduced to occasional sounds that were distinct and separate now, rather than merged into a continuous background. It was late. The night had advanced while he worked. He rose from the chair with the deliberate care of a man of 70 and stood for a moment before the Raphael above the fireplace, a Madonna, the colours rich and quiet in the firelight, and then turned and walked through the passageway to the house. Outside, New York moved through its October evening, unknowing, 23 days before the worst of what was coming would arrive. Outside, New York moved through its October evening, unknowing, 23 days before the worst of what was coming would arrive. Those 23 days passed in a way that financial crises pass in their middle period, not with the sudden violence of their beginning or the concentrated drama of their peak, but with the slow and grinding accumulation of bad news and narrowing options that is, in some respects, harder to endure than either. The newspapers reported. The depositors read. The prices on the exchange declined in their fitful, continuous way. The men who managed the major institutions of New York finance arrived at their offices each morning, knowing approximately what the day would bring, and spending their hours managing the consequences of what they knew. Morgan arrived at 23 Wall Street each morning at approximately 9:30. He departed at 6. In the evenings, he worked in the library. On the weekends and the weekends of October, 1907 were not restful weekends. He received visitors at Madison Avenue and conducted by telephone and messenger the communications that the developing situation required. The routine of his days was not superficially different from the routine of ordinary working weeks. The substance beneath it was entirely different. He had sent his examiners into the Knickerbocker Trust Company's books in the second week of October. The examination was conducted quietly, without announcement, by two men whose professional discretion was beyond question, and whose technical competence he had verified personally over the course of previous engagements. They worked through the Knickerbocker's loan portfolio, and its reserve position, and its deposit structure, with the methodical attention of forensic accountants, which is what they essentially were, and they reported their findings to Morgan in a series of documents that arrived at the library in the evenings, and that he read with the same careful attention he brought to everything. What they found was not simple. The Knickerbocker was not, in the straightforward sense, insolvent. Its assets, valued at the prices that prevailed before the crisis began, exceeded its liabilities. But those valuations were contingent in ways that the current environment was making visible. A portion of its loan portfolio consisted of loans to enterprises whose value was declining with the market and whose ability to repay was becoming questionable. The reserves it maintained against its deposit base were adequate under the trust company regulations of New York State, but thin by the more conservative standards of the national banks. In a calm market, in ordinary conditions, none of this would have mattered. The Knickerbocker would have rolled over its loans, met its deposit demands from its ongoing operations, and continued to function as it had functioned for the previous decade. But conditions were not calm, and the ordinary was not what the coming days would bring. On the morning of October the 21st, a Monday, the newspapers of New York reported that the National Bank of Commerce, a large and reputable institution that served as the clearinghouse bank for the Knickerbocker Trust, had decided to stop clearing checks for the Knickerbocker. The decision had been made the previous Friday, and it had been communicated to the Knickerbocker's officers over the weekend. Its announcement in the Monday papers was the public declaration of something that had previously been confined to the knowledge of a relatively small number of financial professionals. The effect was immediate. By 9 o'clock on the morning of October the 21st, a queue had formed outside the Knickerbocker Trust Company's main office at 5th Avenue and 34th Street. It was not, at 9 o'clock, an especially long queue. It was the queue of people who had read the morning papers and had decided, as a precautionary measure, to withdraw their deposits before anything more alarming happened. They stood in the mild October morning on the sidewalk, outside the bank's imposing limestone facade, in their overcoats and their hats, patient and orderly in the way of people who have not yet entirely convinced themselves that what they are doing is urgent. By 10 o'clock, the queue extended to the corner. By 11, it stretched half a block down 34th Street. By noon, it filled the block. The Knickerbocker had $60 million in deposits. It had, in its vaults and available through its clearinghouse relationships, a fraction of that sum immediately accessible. The fraction was not small by the standards that had previously governed the management of trust companies in New York. It was, however, small relative to the demand that was now being made on it, and the demand was not going to stop. Morgan knew the queue had formed before the newspapers could report it. His network of information in the financial district was such that significant events reached him within the hour of their occurrence, sometimes within minutes. He had known, by mid-morning, that the Knickerbocker was facing a run. He had known, by early afternoon, that the run was not a minor disturbance, but a genuine crisis, that the volume of withdrawals was exceeding the institution's capacity to meet them from its available resources, and that without intervention the Knickerbocker would not be able to remain open. The question of whether to intervene, and this was the question that Morgan had been preparing to answer for the preceding 3 weeks, was not a simple question. It was not simple because the Knickerbocker's condition, as his examiners had established, was not simply a matter of confidence. The institution was not merely illiquid. It was, in the judgment of the men he had sent to look at its books, in a condition that made its ultimate solvency uncertain. To lend it money in these circumstances would be to deploy the resources of the Morgan firm, and the resources of whatever coalition he could assemble, against a position whose true value was unknown. a commitment whose downside was not bounded in any clear way. He made the decision not to intervene in the Knickerbocker's run. This decision, which has been examined and debated by historians and economists for more than a century, was not made lightly or quickly or without awareness of its consequences. It was made on the basis of the information he had, the most complete information available to anyone in the financial district, and on the basis of the principle that had guided his interventions in every previous crisis: that resources deployed to save an institution should be deployed in the confidence that the institution was fundamentally sound, that its difficulties were those of liquidity rather than solvency, that the investment of the funds necessary to stop the run would produce an institution that could, when confidence returned, meet its obligations and repay what it had borrowed. The Knickerbocker did not meet that standard, in his judgment. The examiners he had trusted had told him so, but his decision not to save the Knickerbocker was accompanied by an understanding that was equally clear and equally consequential, that the Knickerbocker's failure would not be the end of the crisis. It would be the beginning of a more dangerous phase. The failure of a trust company of that size and prominence would communicate to every depositor in every trust company in New York that the institutions they had trusted with their savings were not safe. The psychology of panic, the self-fulfilling dynamic by which fear of failure produces the very failure it fears, would propagate outward from the Knickerbocker to the next institution, and from that institution to the next, until either the propagation was stopped by some external force or it exhausted itself by destroying everything it touched. The external force in the United States of 1907 was Morgan. The Knickerbocker Trust Company suspended payments at noon on October the 21st. Charles Barney, its president, walked out of the building through the queue that had been gathering since morning and made no statement to the newspapers that were waiting for him. The queue, finding the doors closed, dispersed slowly. By mid-afternoon, the news had travelled through the financial district and across the city, and the newspapers were preparing their evening editions. Morgan received the news at 23 Wall Street and gave no immediate public response. He had been expecting it, and he had been spending the hours of the morning in preparation for what would follow it, not in an attempt to save the Knickerbocker, which he had already decided he would not do, but in an attempt to prevent the failure of the Knickerbocker from becoming the first in a series of failures that would be collectively unmanageable. The second institution to come under immediate pressure was the Trust Company of America, which had its main offices at 37 Wall Street, and which was, by most measures, a substantially sounder institution than the Knickerbocker had been. Its deposits were approximately $50 million. Its loan portfolio was more conservative than the Knickerbocker's, its reserves more adequate, its management less entangled in the speculative enthusiasms of the preceding years. But it was a trust company, and it was in New York, and the depositors who had read the afternoon papers about the Knickerbocker were not making fine distinctions between one trust company and another. The queue that formed outside the Trust Company of America on the afternoon of October the 21st was the queue of people who had decided that trust companies were not safe as a category, and who wanted their money back as quickly as it could be provided. Morgan sent a man to examine the Trust Company of America's books that same afternoon. The examination was completed by evening. The report that came back to the library at Madison Avenue was different from the report that had come back from the Knickerbocker. The Trust Company of America was, in the judgment of the examiner, a sound institution. Its difficulties were those of liquidity, not solvency. Its loan portfolio, while not without risk, did not contain the concentrated exposures that had made the Knickerbocker's position uncertain. Its management was competent, if it could be provided with sufficient resources to meet its depositors' demands over the next several days, if the run could be slowed and then stopped, if confidence could be restored, it could survive. This was the institution he would save. The decision to save the Trust Company of America was made on the evening of October the 21st, in the East Room of the library at 219 Madison Avenue, in the presence of several of Morgan's partners, and in the quiet that followed the departure of the examiner who had brought the report. The fire was burning. The books watched from their cases. Morgan sat in his chair and listened to the partner's summary of the examiner's findings, and asked 3 questions, the last of which, what resources would be needed, and over what period, was the question that set the work of the next several days in motion. The answer to the last question was large, and the period was short. The Trust Company of America's depositors were withdrawing money at a rate that would exhaust its available resources within days. To stop the run, or rather to slow it to a pace that the institution could sustain while confidence was being restored, would require injections of cash significant enough to demonstrate to depositors and to the financial community that the institution had behind it resources that exceeded any likely demand. The demonstration effect was as important as the financial reality. A run was a phenomenon of psychology as much as finance, and stopping it required convincing the people who were withdrawing their deposits that the institution was not in danger, and that the best evidence of this was the visible commitment of people whose judgment was trusted. The commitment had to be Morgan's, not because his firm alone had the resources, it did not at the scale required, but because his commitment would be the signal that organized the commitments of others. If Morgan was putting money into the Trust Company of America, the other banks would follow. Not necessarily because they trusted the Trust Company of America, but because they trusted Morgan's judgment about it, and because they understood, the shrewder ones understood this explicitly, that their own survival in the coming weeks depended on the success of a coordinated response, and that the coordinated response would succeed only if Morgan led it. He spent the remainder of the evening making calculations and writing notes. He did not sleep much that night. He had not slept much for several nights, which was unusual for him. He was generally a sound sleeper, with the constitutional capacity for rest that distinguished certain men of great energy from the merely anxious. But the current situation was one in which the ordinary rhythms of rest were not entirely available. There was too much to think about, too many variables that could move in the night and that would need to be assessed afresh in the morning. October the 22nd was a Tuesday. He was at the partners' room by 8. The morning brought news that confirmed the direction of the previous day's events. The Trust Company of America had opened its doors at 9 o'clock, and the queue outside it was longer than it had been when it closed. The news of the Knickerbockers' suspension had spread through the city overnight, amplified by the evening papers and the morning papers that followed them, and the depositors who had been watching and waiting had decided in substantial numbers that waiting was no longer the appropriate response. The queue on Wall Street was orderly. The people in it were not panicking in the dramatic sense. They were not shouting, were not pushing, were not displaying the kind of visible distress that the word panic conjures. They were simply standing in line to withdraw their money, which was their right, and which was, from the perspective of any individual depositor, entirely rational. This was one of the things about financial panics that Morgan had understood for 40 years and that never stopped being important: the rationality of the individual action and the irrationality of the collective outcome. Each person standing in that queue was behaving sensibly, given what they knew and what they feared. Each withdrawal was a reasonable precaution. Taken together, the reasonable precautions of tens of thousands of reasonable people produced an outcome that destroyed value on a scale that none of them intended and none of them would have chosen. He sent word to the Trust Company of America that funds would be available. The mechanism through which the funds were delivered was the mechanism of the Clearinghouse Loan Certificate, an instrument that the New York Clearinghouse Association had used in previous crises to provide emergency liquidity to member institutions without the delays that normal banking procedures imposed. The clearinghouse certificates were not cash, but they were acceptable as cash between member banks, which meant that an institution receiving them could use them to meet its obligations to other banks, even if it lacked the actual currency to do so. They were, in effect, a form of mutual guarantee, the member banks of the clearinghouse collectively standing behind the certificates, each member's willingness to accept them, from every other member, creating the network of mutual confidence that gave the certificates their value. But the clearinghouse mechanism required the agreement of the major member banks, and the major member banks were not, in the first days of the crisis, eager to provide it. Each of them was watching its own position, calculating its own exposure, managing its own depositors' demands. Each of them understood in the abstract that a collective response was in everyone's interest. Each of them was also, in the concrete present of a financial crisis, inclined to protect its own resources before committing them to the defense of institutions that were not its own. This was the problem that Morgan had been anticipating for 3 weeks. Not the financial problem. The financial problem was real, but it was, in principle, solvable. The problem was the coordination problem, the difficulty of persuading a group of individuals, each of whom had a rational reason to defect from the collective response, to commit instead to the coordinated action that the collective interest required. He began making calls. The calls were made from the partner's room and from the library and, in at least one instance, from the private dining car of his yacht, the Corsair, which was moored at the Hudson River Pier and which served, in these years, as a kind of floating conference room for meetings that required privacy and the particular atmosphere of a space that was neither a bank nor a club nor a private house, but partook of all three. The people he called were the presidents and senior partners of the major New York banks, the National City Bank, the First National Bank, the Hanover National, the Chase National, several others. And the conversations he had with them were the conversations of a man who understood precisely what he needed from each of them and who had the combination of information, authority, and credibility necessary to make the request in a way that was difficult to refuse. He did not threaten. He did not appeal to sentiment or to patriotism or to the vague generalities of civic responsibility. He presented the situation as he understood it, the condition of the Trust Company of America, the resources that would be required to stabilize it, the consequences of failing to provide those resources, the specific commitment that he was asking each institution to make. And he made clear, by the tone and the precision of the presentation, that the decision he was asking them to make was a business decision with a clear and calculable rationale, not a charitable donation or an act of sacrifice. The rationale was this: the failure of the Trust Company of America would not stop the panic, it would deepen it. The next institution to come under pressure would be under more severe pressure than the Trust Company had faced, because each successive failure reinforced the depositors' conviction that trust companies were unsafe, and each reinforced conviction brought more depositors to more doors. The only way to stop the cascade was to demonstrate, convincingly and publicly, that at least one major trust company had the resources to meet any demand that could be placed on it, that standing behind it was a coalition of institutions and individuals whose combined resources exceeded any conceivable run. This demonstration would not be cheap, but it would be less expensive than the alternative, which was a cascade of failures that would eventually reach the regulated banks themselves, and that would, if it went far enough, destroy the credit mechanisms on which every business in the country depended. This was the argument. It was not a comfortable argument. It was an argument that required the men who heard it to look clearly at a situation they would have preferred to look away from, and to commit resources that they would have preferred to keep in reserve. But it was an accurate argument, and the men Morgan was making it to were, most of them, intelligent enough to recognize its accuracy when it was laid before them without sentiment or distortion. By the evening of October the 22nd, commitments had been made. Not enough commitments, not yet, and not all of the institutions he had approached had agreed. But enough of the major banks had indicated their willingness to participate in a coordinated response that the outline of the response was visible. A lending pool, organized by Morgan's firm, drawing on the resources of the participating institutions, available to provide liquidity to sound trust companies that were facing runs caused by the general collapse of confidence rather than by specific problems with their own books. The Trust Company of America opened its doors on October the 23rd with Morgan's funds behind it, and with the knowledge, communicated not through public announcement, but through the channels of the financial district, where information traveled quickly and reliably among the people who needed it, that the resources available to it exceeded the likely demand. The queue that formed outside it on the morning of the 23rd was long. The queue on the afternoon of the 23rd was shorter. The queue on the morning of the 24th was shorter still. The run on the Trust Company of America had not ended, but it had slowed, and in the arithmetic of a bank run, a slowing was the first sign that the dynamic could be reversed. Morgan worked through these days from before 8 in the morning until well after midnight, a schedule that would have been demanding for a man of 35, and that was, for a man of 70, extraordinary. He ate when food was brought to him. He slept in brief intervals. He received visitors continuously: bankers, brokers, lawyers, industrialists, newspaper publishers, the Secretary of the Treasury, who who had come to New York from Washington because the crisis had reached a scale at which the federal government could no longer remain merely observant, and he managed each conversation with the same combination of complete attention and complete economy of expression that characterized all his working relationships. The Secretary of the Treasury was George Cortelyou, a man of 50 who had served previously as Roosevelt's private secretary, and who had been appointed to the Treasury with qualifications that were more political than financial. He arrived in New York on October the 23rd and came to Madison Avenue that evening, and the meeting between the two men, the elected official representing the formal authority of the United States government, and the private citizen who was managing the actual response to the crisis, was a meeting whose significance neither man commented on publicly, but that both of them understood. Cortelyou brought something that Morgan needed: the authority to deploy the resources of the federal government in support of the stabilization effort. The Treasury had the power, under existing law, to deposit government funds in the major New York banks, which would increase their reserves and their capacity to lend. This was not a large power by the standards of what would later become possible. The Federal Reserve did not yet exist, and the mechanisms for large-scale government intervention in the financial system had not yet been developed. But it was something, and in the arithmetic of the crisis, something was not nothing. Morgan told Cortelyou what was needed and what it would cost, and where the Treasury's deposits would be most useful. He did not ask for permission. He explained the situation, as he explained it to everyone who came to his library in those weeks, with the precision and the directness of a man presenting an analysis rather than making a request, presenting it in the confidence that the analysis was correct and that anyone of sufficient intelligence and good faith who heard it would reach the same conclusions he had. Cortelyou agreed to deposit $25 million of government funds in the major New York banks. It was not, in Morgan's assessment, enough. But it was what Cortelyou could authorize, and Morgan added it to the resources available to the stabilization effort and moved on to the next problem. The next problem arrived on the morning of October the 24th. The stock exchange had been declining throughout the previous week, but the decline had been, by the standards of what was now possible, orderly. Prices were falling, but the market was functioning. Buyers and sellers were finding each other at prices that, however uncomfortable, were prices at which transactions could be completed. On the morning of October the 24th, this began to change. The mechanism was call money. The brokers who operated on the floor of the exchange had financed a large portion of their clients' purchases with borrowed money, call loans, repayable on demand, that were the standard instrument of leveraged investment in this era. The banks that had provided these loans were, under the pressure of their own depositors' demands, beginning to call them in. The brokers who received the calls needed to sell securities to raise the cash to repay the loans, which drove prices down, which reduced the value of the collateral behind the loans that had not yet been called, which prompted the banks to call those loans as well. This was a spiral, and on the morning of October the 24th, the spiral was accelerating. By 11 o'clock, the call money rate, the interest rate at which new loans were available on the exchange, had risen to 70%. 70% per annum, which was not the rate at which money was actually being lent, because at 70%, essentially no new money was available at any price. The market for call loans had effectively ceased to function. The brokers who needed to roll their loans, who had expected, when they arranged their clients' financing, that the money would be renewed in the ordinary way, could not find lenders at any price. A market without call money was a market that could not sustain its existing level of activity. Orders to sell, coming in from clients whose brokers had told them that their loans were being called and that they needed to raise cash immediately, were arriving on the exchange floor faster than buyers could be found. Prices were not just declining, they were gapping, moving not smoothly from one level to the next, but jumping discontinuously as sellers found that the buyers who had been there the previous hour were no longer there. The president of the New York Stock Exchange, Ransom Thomas, came to Morgan's office at 23 Wall Street at approximately noon on October the 24th. He came without an appointment, which was itself unusual. Appointments with Morgan were not made casually, and they were not abandoned casually. But the situation on the exchange floor was such that ordinary protocols had been set aside. He told Morgan that the exchange might need to close, that the volume of forced selling and the absence of call money had created conditions in which normal trading was no longer possible, and that a premature close a suspension of trading in the middle of the business day, was being considered as an alternative to a collapse of prices to levels that would destroy whatever value remained in the market. Morgan listened to this and said, "The exchange will not close." It was not a prediction. It was a statement of intent, delivered in the tone of a man announcing a decision rather than offering an opinion. Thomas, who had come to Madison Avenue expecting a conversation and found instead a verdict, received it with the combination of relief and unease that characterized the reactions of most people who brought problems to Morgan and received this kind of response. Morgan called a meeting. He sent word to the presidents and senior partners of the major New York banks, the same men he had been calling and meeting with for the preceding week, and he asked them to come to 23 Wall Street at 2:30 in the afternoon. The request had the character of a summons, and it was received as one. By 2:30, the partners' room at 23 Wall Street contained most of the senior leadership of New York's financial industry, men who controlled, in aggregate, the resources of the largest banking system in the Western Hemisphere, and who were present because Morgan had asked them to be present, and because when Morgan asked, people came. He stood at the head of the room and spoke for perhaps 3 minutes. He described the condition of the exchange floor, the absence of call money, the forced selling, the risk of a complete cessation of trading, in terms that were precise and unambiguous. He said that $25 million was needed, immediately, to be made available as call loans to the brokers, who were facing the calls they could not meet. He said that this money needed to be committed in the next 15 minutes, because the exchange floor could not sustain another hour of the conditions that currently prevailed. He said that he would commit $6 million from his own firm, and he looked around the room and asked who would commit the rest. The room was quiet for a moment. Then the commitments came, not slowly, not with negotiation, not with the careful qualification and counter-proposal that normally characterized financial commitments at this level. The men in the room, several of whom had been reluctant participants in earlier meetings, several of whom had provided their commitments to the stabilization effort with visible reservation, committed their shares in a matter of minutes. Within 15 minutes of the meeting's opening, $27 million had been pledged. The money was transmitted to the exchange floor, where it was made available as call loans at 10%, far below the rates that had been prevailing that morning, low enough to attract borrowers, visible enough to communicate to the market that the money had arrived and that the worst was over for today. The exchange closed that afternoon at the normal time. Prices had recovered from their morning lows. The forced selling had slowed as the call money became available. The market had not collapsed. Morgan walked back to Madison Avenue through the October afternoon, the buildings casting their long shadows across the streets of the financial district, the air carrying the smell of the city in the early evening, coal and horse, and the particular metallic quality of New York in October. He walked slowly as he always walked, and if people on the street recognized him, and many of them did, because his face had been in the newspapers for 40 years, and his nose made him as immediately identifiable as any public figure in the country, they stepped aside and let him pass without speaking to him. He went to the library. He ate dinner. He returned to the East Room and sat in his chair and worked through the reports that had been accumulating through the day, making his marks, asking his questions, assembling the picture. The picture, as it assembled itself on the evening of October the 24th, showed a situation that was not better but was not worse. The Trust Company of America was still running, but more slowly. The exchange had stayed open. The banks had committed resources. Cortelyou's treasury deposits were in place. The spiral had not stopped, but it had slowed. There was more to do. More institutions to examine, more commitments to organize, more conversations to have. The crisis had not ended, but the response had begun in earnest, and the response was organized around a center that held, around the figure in the leather armchair in the East Room, reading his documents by firelight, making his marks, preparing for the next day. There was more to do, more institutions to examine, more commitments to organize, more conversations to have. The crisis had not ended, but the response had begun in earnest, and the response was organized around a center that held, around the figure in the leather armchair in the East Room, reading his documents by firelight, making his marks, preparing for the next day. The days that followed October the 24th had a quality that those who lived through them, the partners of Morgan's firm, the bank presidents who were called to his library in the evenings, the secretaries and assistants who managed the logistics of what was becoming, in effect, a privately organised central bank operating out of a marble building on Madison Avenue, later described in terms that reached for something beyond the ordinary vocabulary of professional memory. It was not quite fear, most of them said. It was not quite excitement. It was something more specific and more concentrated than either. The particular quality of attention that comes when the stakes are very high and the outcomes are genuinely uncertain, and the work that needs to be done is clear, but the doing of it is not simple, and the person responsible for it is performing that work with a precision and a steadiness that makes you believe, watching him, that it can be done. The library had become, by the last days of October, a place where the American financial crisis was being managed. Not formally. There was no formal authority, no government sanction, no regulatory mandate under which Morgan was operating. He was a private citizen, the senior partner of a private firm, and everything he was doing was being done on the basis of private negotiation and private commitment, and the weight of a private reputation that had been built across 40 years, and that was now being deployed at the full extent of what it could support. The irony of this, that the largest economy in the world was being kept from collapse by one man operating from his personal library without any legal authority to do what he was doing, was not lost on those who were watching. It was, in fact, the central fact about the situation, the fact that would eventually produce the political consequences that Morgan himself understood were inevitable. But that was for later. In the last days of October and the first days of November of 1907, the work was the work. October the 25th was a Friday. The Exchange opened and the Trust Company of America opened, and the other major trust companies that were still functioning opened, and the day passed in the anxious, watchful way of the preceding days. Queues that were long but not growing, prices that were declining but not collapsing, call money that was expensive but available. Morgan spent the morning at 23 Wall Street and the afternoon at the library, receiving visitors and reviewing reports and making the calculations that the next phase of the effort would require. The next phase had a specific problem at its centre that was different from the problems he had been managing since October the 21st. The Trust Company of America was stabilizing, slowly, incompletely, with the daily anxiety of not knowing whether the next morning would bring a longer queue or a shorter one. But it was not the only institution that needed attention. The Lincoln Trust Company, smaller than the Trust Company of America, but connected to it in various ways through the web of correspondent relationships and shared depositors that linked the trust companies of New York, was also under pressure. Several of the smaller savings banks in the outer boroughs were reporting elevated withdrawal activity. The brokerage houses on the exchange floor were still fragile, still dependent on the day-by-day renewal of the call money that Morgan's coalition was providing, still capable of being pushed back into crisis by a single day's failure of confidence. And below all of this, running as a continuous current beneath the daily management of specific institutions, was the larger problem that had not yet been addressed: the general condition of the New York Trust Company sector, whose collective reserve position was thin enough that a sustained run, one that continued past the point where the resources of any coalition could meet it, could exhaust even the most sound of the surviving institutions. The response that Morgan had organized was adequate to manage a crisis of limited duration and limited scope. Whether it was adequate to manage a crisis that persisted and spread was a question that he did not yet have a satisfying answer to. He ate lunch at Delmonico's on Friday with two men whose names appear in the accounts of this period only obliquely. Men who were, by the description of those who saw Morgan with them, senior figures in the trust company sector, men whose institutions were under pressure and who had come to discuss with Morgan the terms under which support might be available. The conversation lasted 2 hours. What was agreed is not fully recorded, but the institutions represented across the table from Morgan at that lunch were still functioning the following week, which suggests that the agreements reached were adequate to their purpose. He returned to the library that evening and did not leave it until well after midnight. The East Room was occupied by a rotating series of visitors throughout the evening. Bank presidents arriving and departing, partners from the firm coming with reports and leaving with instructions, a representative of the Secretary of the Treasury, who had questions about the pace and scope of the stabilization effort, and who received answers that were precise and, by the account of the representative who later described the meeting to Cortelyou, slightly unnerving in their completeness. Morgan knew exactly what was happening and exactly what he needed. He was not confused, and he was not uncertain, and the combination of these qualities in a situation of general confusion and general uncertainty was, to those who encountered it, a specific and notable experience. The weekend of October, the 26th and 27th, brought no rest. Morgan spent both days in the library, conducting the meetings and the correspondence and the telephone calls that the situation required, and hosting in the evenings gatherings of a dozen or more of the men who were managing the various elements of the response. These gatherings had a quality that several participants later described as unlike any other meeting they had attended in their professional lives. They took place in the East Room, with the fire burning and the paintings on the walls and the books behind their bronze grills, and the contrast between the beauty of the room and the gravity of what was being discussed gave the proceedings a particular atmosphere, an atmosphere of occasion, of something being done in a setting that was equal to its importance. Morgan sat in his armchair and listened and asked questions and made decisions. He did not lead the discussions in the sense of managing their direction, or summarizing their conclusions, or performing the various diplomatic functions that meetings of this kind normally require someone to perform. He sat and listened, and when he had heard enough to know what needed to be decided, he said what needed to be done. The men around him were capable men, senior bankers, most of them, men who had managed large and complex institutions for decades, and who were not accustomed to deferring to anyone. They deferred to Morgan. Not because he compelled deference. He did not raise his voice, did not threaten, did not perform the kind of dominance that is designed to suppress opposition. They deferred because the quality of his understanding of the situation was manifestly superior to their own, and because the decisions he made were, when examined, consistently correct, and because in the presence of someone who knows precisely what needs to be done in a situation where everyone else is uncertain, the natural response is to follow. By the end of the first weekend of November, the Trust Company of America had survived another week. The Lincoln Trust had been stabilized with a smaller infusion of funds from the pool that Morgan's coalition had established. The exchange had continued to function. The daily injections of cool money had been maintained. The city had not descended into the kind of financial chaos that the failure of the Knickerbocker had seemed, on the afternoon of October the 21st, to be the opening movement of. But the crisis was not over, and on the morning of November the 2nd, a Saturday, it acquired a new dimension that tested Morgan's response in a way that nothing that had come before it had tested it. The Moore and Schley brokerage firm was one of the larger and more prominent brokerage houses on the exchange. It had been in business for decades, managed by men of established reputation, serving a client base that included a substantial number of the wealthiest investors in the city. It was not, in the ordinary sense, a vulnerable institution, not a trust company operating with thin reserves, not a speculative enterprise of the Heinze variety, but a functioning brokerage house of the kind that was the backbone of the exchange's operation. What made Moore and Schley vulnerable in November of 1907 was a specific and concrete problem. It held, as collateral for loans it had extended to various clients, a large block of shares in the Tennessee Coal, Iron and Railroad Company, known as TC&I. These shares had been given as collateral at prices that had prevailed before the crisis, and those prices no longer prevailed. As the market had declined through October, the value of the TC&I shares had declined with it, to the point where the loans they were collateralizing were no longer fully secured. The banks that had extended credit to Moore and Schley, holding the TC&I shares as collateral, were entitled to call those loans and demand additional collateral or repayment, and they were beginning to exercise that entitlement. Moore and Schley could not easily provide additional collateral, because the collateral it held, the TC&I shares, was the problem rather than the solution. Selling the shares would have been the obvious mechanism for raising cash, but selling a large block of shares in a depressed market would have driven the price down further, reducing the value of the very collateral that the creditor banks were holding, which would have given those banks reason to demand still more collateral, and the spiral would have continued downward until Moore and Schley was exhausted. The solution that presented itself and that was brought to Morgan on the morning of November the 2nd by Grant Schley, one of the firm's senior partners, in a meeting that Schley had requested with a directness that suggested he understood the urgency of his situation, was that the TC&I shares should be acquired by a large and credit-worthy buyer at a price that was high enough to restore the collateral's value, that the loans should be repaid from the proceeds, and that Moore and Schley should thereby be freed from the obligation that was about to destroy it. The buyer that this logic pointed to was United States Steel. United States Steel was the largest industrial corporation in the world, the product of Morgan's own organizing work in 1901, when he had assembled the constituent companies of the steel industry into a single entity that commanded a majority of American steel production and had been capitalized at $1 billion, a sum so large that even the newspapers that had been covering large transactions for years struggled to convey its scale. The corporation was Morgan's creation in a specific and personal sense. He had conceived it, organized it, financed it, and maintained a close interest in its management in the years since its formation. Its board of directors included men whose relationship to Morgan was one of long professional association, and its chief executive, Elbert Gary, was a man whose judgment Morgan trusted and with whom he communicated regularly. The acquisition of TC&I by United States Steel would solve the Moore and Schley problem. It would provide a credit-worthy buyer for the shares, at a price that could be established by negotiation rather than by a distressed sale into a declining market, and it would allow Moore and Schley to repay its loans and survive. This was the immediate logic. But there was a complication, and the complication was large. Theodore Roosevelt was the President of the United States. He had been president since 1901, the year of United States Steel's formation, and his presidency had been characterized by an approach to the large industrial combinations, the trusts, in the language of the period, that was distinguished from the approach of his predecessors by its willingness to use the power of the federal government to limit their influence and, in some cases, to break them up. He had brought antitrust proceedings against Northern Securities, which Morgan had also organized and had won. He had brought proceedings against Standard Oil and against the beef trusts, and against various other combinations that had attracted the attention of his administration. The Sherman Antitrust Act was the instrument of these proceedings, and its application to large combinations was, under Roosevelt, more vigorous than it had been under anyone who had preceded him. The acquisition of TC&I by United States Steel was a transaction that would further increase the already dominant position of United States Steel in the American steel industry. Under normal circumstances, in a period when the administration was actively pursuing antitrust actions against large combinations, this was exactly the kind of transaction that would attract the attention of the Justice Department and potentially be challenged as a violation of the Sherman Act. These were not normal circumstances. Morgan understood this, and he understood what it meant for the transaction to proceed, that the administration needed to be approached, and that the approach needed to produce a commitment from the president that the transaction would not be challenged. This was a delicate thing to ask. It was asking the president to make an exception to the policy his administration had been pursuing for 6 years, to provide, in effect, a private guarantee to a private corporation that a specific transaction would not be prosecuted, in exchange for the corporation's agreement to undertake a transaction that would help prevent a financial panic from becoming something worse. Morgan sent Elbert Gary and Henry Clay Frick, the former chairman of Carnegie Steel, whose involvement in the steel industry predated even Morgan's, and whose relationship with Roosevelt had certain qualities of mutual respect that Morgan's relationship with Roosevelt rather conspicuously lacked, to Washington on the morning of November the 4th, a Monday, with instructions to see the president before the exchange opened and to obtain whatever assurance the president was prepared to give. Gary and Frick arrived at the White House at approximately 8:30 in the morning. Roosevelt was at his breakfast. They were shown in, and the conversation that followed was one of the most consequential private conversations in the history of American business, not because of what was said exactly, but because of what was agreed, and because of what the agreement made possible. Gary explained the situation to Roosevelt in terms that were, by the president's own subsequent account, clear and specific. The acquisition of TC&I by United States Steel would, under any dispassionate analysis of the steel industry's competitive structure increased the combination's dominance in ways that the Sherman Act might be construed to address. But the failure to make the acquisition, in the current circumstances, would likely contribute to the collapse of a major brokerage house, which would likely contribute to further deterioration of conditions on the exchange, which would likely, this was the central claim, and it was advanced with the supporting detail that Morgan had prepared, contribute to a deepening of the financial crisis in ways that would cause serious harm to a very large number of ordinary Americans. Roosevelt listened. He asked several questions. He was not, on the evidence of his later writings about the episode, entirely comfortable with what he was being asked. He understood that he was being presented with a situation designed to compel a decision that he would not have made in different circumstances, and he was too intelligent not to recognize the structure of the argument and the pressure it was designed to create. But he was also a man of genuine public responsibility, and he was being told by credible people that the financial system of the country was under severe stress, and that a specific action, an action that he could enable by agreeing not to oppose it, would help stabilize that system. He told Gary and Frick that, while he could not speak for the Justice Department, and while he could not formally commit the administration to any particular course of action, he did not see any objection to the acquisition of TC&I by United States Steel under the circumstances that had been described to him. It was enough. Gary and Frick returned to New York by the first available train. The acquisition was announced before the exchange opened on November the 4th. The terms, United States Steel acquiring the Tennessee Coal, Iron and Railroad Company for $45 per share in steel bonds, were presented to the market as a business transaction of the ordinary kind, with no public discussion of the circumstances that had made it necessary or the conversation in the White House that had made it possible. Moore and Schlee's position was resolved. The loans were repaid. The brokerage house survived. The announcement had the effect on the market that Morgan had calculated it would have. The willingness of United States Steel, the largest and most creditworthy industrial corporation in the world, to make a significant acquisition in the current environment, communicated something to the market that Morgan had been trying to communicate by other means for 2 weeks, that the situation was manageable, that sound enterprises would continue to function, that the panic was not going to destroy everything it touched. The exchange opened steadily on November the 4th. It closed steadily. The call money rate fell from the elevated levels of the preceding week. It was not the end. The Trust Company of America continued to face elevated withdrawal activity for several more weeks. The Lincoln Trust continued to require support. The general condition of the financial system remained fragile in ways that would not be fully resolved for months. But the momentum of the crisis had shifted. The direction of events, which had been moving for 3 weeks toward outcomes that were genuinely catastrophic in their potential scope, had been reversed. The spiral had been stopped. The instrument that had stopped it was assembled, managed, and sustained by one man working from a private library on Madison Avenue, without any formal authority, without any government mandate, and without any mechanism for compelling the cooperation of the banks and bankers whose resources had made the response possible, other than the weight of his judgment and the 50-year record of his word. The recognition of what had happened, of what it meant that the United States government had been unable to respond to the most serious financial crisis of the modern era, and that the response had been organized by a private citizen, arrived in the public discourse with a speed and an intensity that was itself a measure of the strangeness of the situation. The newspapers, which had been covering the crisis with the breathless attention of editors who understood they were witnessing something significant, turned their attention from the mechanics of the stabilization to its implications, and the implications were not comfortable for anyone who had been observing the American political economy with care. Senator Nelson Aldrich, the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee and one of the most powerful legislators in Washington, said publicly in the weeks after the crisis that the country could not continue to depend on one man to prevent financial panics. The statement was made as a criticism, or at least as an observation, rather than as praise. But it was, in its substance, entirely accurate, and Morgan knew it. He had known it for years, in fact. He had understood, since the crisis of 1893 at the latest, that the arrangements under which the American financial system operated, arrangements that left the country without a central bank, without a lender of last resort, without any mechanism for coordinating the response to financial crises, except the voluntary cooperation of private institutions organised by whoever happened to have the standing to organise them, were arrangements that would eventually fail in a way that private action could not repair. The Panic of 1907 had not failed in that way, but it had come close enough, and the margin by which it had been prevented from failing in that way was thin enough that the case for a different arrangement was now impossible for serious people to dismiss. The Federal Reserve Act would be signed into law in December of 1913, 6 years after the panic that made it politically possible. The institution it created, the Federal Reserve System, with its 12 regional banks and its board of governors, and its mandate to act as a lender of last resort to the American banking system, was the institutional answer to the question that the Panic of 1907 had posed with unmistakable clarity. What happens when a financial crisis reaches a scale that private action cannot manage? The answer that 1913 provided was a central bank with public authority and public resources, whose job it was to do what Morgan had been doing privately since 1873. Morgan did not live to see the Federal Reserve Act signed. He died in Rome in March of 1913, 9 months before the law was enacted, at the age of 75. He had been travelling in Europe in the winter of 1912 and 13, a trip that was part rest, part the continuation of the art acquisitions that had occupied him for decades, part the movement of a man who had been working at maximum intensity for a very long time, and whose body was beginning to register the cost. He died in the Grand Hotel in Rome, having been ill for several weeks with a condition whose specific nature was not clearly diagnosed at the time, and his body was brought back to New York on the White Star liner Adriatic, which the company provided for the purpose, and he was buried at Cedar Hill Cemetery in Hartford, Connecticut, in the city of his birth. His estate, when it was assessed, was found to be worth approximately $80 million, a large fortune, but not by the standards of the era's very richest men an extraordinary one. Rockefeller, who had been told the figure, is reported to have said, "And to think he was not even a rich man." This remark, which has been repeated many times in the century since, captures something true about Morgan's particular place in the economy of his time, that his power had never been primarily a function of his wealth, which was considerable but not supreme, but of his reputation and his judgment and the specific thing, the fixed point of absolute reliability that his word represented in a financial system that had, in the absence of any other such fixed point, organised itself around him. What he left behind him was not only the stabilised institutions and the resolved crises and the reorganised railroads and the great corporation that bore the name of United States Steel. He left behind something less tangible but more durable, the demonstration, enacted across 40 years and half a dozen crises, that financial panics were not natural disasters in the sense of being beyond human management. They were, in their essence, crises of confidence, self-fulfilling spirals in which the fear of failure produced the very failure it feared. And they could be stopped if someone with sufficient resources and sufficient credibility was willing to stand in the gap and make the commitments that the market needed to see made. The someone did not need to be a government. The resources did not need to be public. The commitment needed to be real, and the credibility needed to be earned, and the judgment needed to be right, more often than it was wrong. Morgan's judgment had been right. It had been right in 1873 and 1884 and 1893 and 1907, and it had been right with a consistency that was not luck and was not simply the product of intelligence, though intelligence was part of it, but was the product of a particular combination of experience and principle, and the specific kind of courage that operates without drama, the courage that does not announce itself, that sits in a leather armchair in a firelit room and reads its documents and makes its marks and rises the next morning to do the same work again with the same steadiness for as long as the work requires. The library at 219 Madison Avenue still stands. It was bequeathed to the public as a museum and research library, the Pierpont Morgan Library as it is now known, and it contains, among other things, the desk at which he worked in the evenings, and the armchair in which he sat by the fire, and the paintings on the walls that watched him think. The East Room is preserved in something close to its condition in October of 1907, the bookshelves behind their bronze grills, The fireplace with its sienna marble surround, the ceiling with its coffered plasterwork, the light that comes through the high windows in the afternoon falling on the same floor it fell on when the crisis was at its worst, and the figure in the armchair was assembling the picture from its pieces, one document at a time, by firelight. The people who passed through that room in the last days of October and the first days of November of 1907, the bank presidents and the brokers and the treasury representatives and the partners and the secretaries and the occasional newspaper publisher who had been granted an audience, came in with varying degrees of fear and uncertainty, and left, most of them, with something that was not exactly confidence, but was the functional equivalent of it. The reassurance that comes from being in the presence of someone who knows what to do and is doing it. This reassurance was not false. It was not the performance of calm in the service of deception. It was the genuine article, the product of 40 years of having been right, of having made the commitment and kept it, of having said that a thing would be done and then doing it. It was enough, in October of 1907, to hold the system together while the resources were assembled and the commitments were made and the spiral was slowed and stopped. It was enough, though only barely, to prevent the financial panic from becoming the economic catastrophe that it had the potential to become. The margin was thin. The outcome was not certain, not on any single day of the 3 weeks of the crisis, not even on the evening of October the 24th, when the commitments had been made and the exchange had closed at the normal hour, and the worst for that day was over. But the margin held, the centre held, and the centre, in October of 1907, was a 70-year-old man sitting in a leather armchair in a marble library on Madison Avenue, reading his documents by firelight, making his marks, waiting for the next day. New York moved on. The queues outside the trust companies grew shorter and then disappeared. The call money rates returned to their normal levels. The stock exchange found its footing in the weeks that followed and began, slowly and unevenly, to recover the ground it had lost. The businesses whose credit had been disrupted returned to operation. The factories that had slowed their production as credit tightened resumed their normal pace. The workers who had been anxious about their wages received them. The farmers whose mortgages had been at risk found that the institutions holding them had survived. The country did not know, in its general understanding of what had happened, the full detail of what had been done to prevent the worst. It knew that there had been a panic, and that it had been stopped, and that Morgan had been involved. The newspapers had covered the crisis extensively, and had identified Morgan as the central figure of the response, but the coverage had necessarily been incomplete. The meetings in the East Room had been private, the commitments had been made in private, the conversations in Washington had been private, and the full picture of what had been managed and how would not be assembled by historians for decades. What the public understood was the outline, that a panic had come, that it had been severe, that it had been stopped, and that the man most responsible for stopping it was 70 years old, and had been doing this kind of work since before most of the people now reading about it had been born. The autumn of 1907 continued in the ordinary way of October and November in New York. The days shortening, the temperatures falling, the trees in the parks and the churchyards completing their turn from green to gold to bare. At 219 Madison Avenue, the East Room returned to its ordinary purposes. The reading and the cataloguing and the quiet accumulation of things of beauty and importance that had been its primary occupation before the crisis had converted it into an emergency operations center for the American financial system. The fire burned in the evenings, the books sat in their cases, the Raphael hung above the fireplace, and in the leather armchair the figure read,